Corregidor Island, May 5, 1942. The night sky above Corregidor Island burned white. It was just after 11 p.m. when the first Japanese artillery rounds crashed into the shattered ridgelines of topside. The island had already endured weeks of bombardment. Concrete was fractured. Palm trees were splintered into jagged spears. The air smelled of cordite, salt, and smoke drifting across Manila Bay from the northern shore. Landing craft engines growled in the darkness. Japanese troops of the 61st Infantry Regiment pushed toward what they believed were the final American positions. Reports suggested the defenders were exhausted, starving, outnumbered. The siege had reduced them to shadows. By midnight, forward observation posts fell silent. Machine guns that had barked for weeks suddenly stopped. To the Japanese assault units advancing inland, it appeared the last Americans had finally been surrounded. Then the ground itself seemed to move, from blasted hillsides and tunnel mouths carved deep into rock. U.S. troops began to emerge, rifles ready, helmets streaked with dust, faces hollow but unbroken. The island was not finished. Had been waiting beneath the surface. The road to Corregidor on December 8, 1941. Just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese aircraft appeared over the Philippines. The invasion was swift, deliberate, and overwhelming. The Philippines were not simply another colonial possession. They were an American Commonwealth, strategically positioned astride the sea lanes of Southeast Asia. Control of the islands meant control of access to the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, and the oil fields Japan desperately needed to sustain its war machine. At the center of this defense stood General Douglas MacArthur, commander of United States Army forces in the Far East. His mission had been clear: defend the Philippines against Japanese aggression. But the timetable collapsed within days. Japanese forces under General Masaharu Hama landed at multiple points on Luzon beginning December 22, 1941. There, troops were battle-hardened from campaigns in China. Their air superiority was immediate and devastating. 1,942 American airfields were crippled on the ground. Supply lines fractured. Communication faltered. MacArthur's original war plan, War Plan Orange, called for a fighting withdrawal to the Bataan Peninsula if the defense of Luzon failed. From there, American and Filipino forces would hold out until reinforcements could arrive from the United States. But no reinforcements were coming. By early January 1942, Allied forces had begun their withdrawal into Bataan. Behind them, Manila was declared an open city to spare it from destruction. Japanese troops entered the capital on January 2nd. The defenders, a mixture of U.S. Army regulars, National Guard units, Philippine scouts, and newly mobilized Filipino divisions, dug into the jungle-clad ridges of Bataan. Supplies were already short. Many units had received only minimal training. Ammunition was limited. Food stocks were calculated for months, but consumption and disease quickly eroded the margin. Across the mouth of Manila Bay lay the island fortress of Corregidor Island. Shaped like a tadpole and heavily fortified since the early 20th century, Corregidor guarded the entrance to the bay. Massive coastal guns pointed seaward. Concrete batteries were embedded into hills known as topside, middleside, and bottomside. Beneath them ran a reinforced tunnel network, the Malinta Tunnel, originally constructed to withstand naval bombardment. As Bataan absorbed wave after wave of Japanese assault, Corregidor became more than a fortress. It became the command center of the entire Philippine defense. MacArthur moved his headquarters into the Malinta Tunnel in late December. The underground quarters housed communications rooms, hospital wards, storage chambers, and living quarters. Generators hummed continuously. Maps were pinned to damp concrete walls. Messengers moved through dim light carrying casualty reports and dwindling supply figures. Above ground, Japanese artillery steadily tightened its arc of fire. By February, American and Filipino forces on Bataan were malnourished. Malaria spread through the ranks. Ammunition stocks fell to critical levels. The men fought with determination, but the imbalance in air power and fresh enemy reserves was decisive. In Washington, strategic priority had already shifted toward Europe. The Philippines would have to hold on their own. On March 11, 1942, under direct orders from President Franklin D. Roosevelt, MacArthur departed Corregidor by PT boat under cover of darkness, eventually escaping to Australia. Before leaving, he delivered the words that would echo through the war. "I shall return." Command on Corregidor passed to Lieutenant General Jonathan M. Wainwright. The defenders remained. On April 9, 1942, after months of resistance, Bataan fell. Approximately 75,000 American and Filipino troops were forced into captivity. What followed became known as the Bataan Death March, a brutal forced transfer northward that would claim thousands of lives. Corregidor now stood alone. Japanese artillery batteries were repositioned along the southern shores of Bataan. From there, heavy guns began systematic bombardment of the island fortress. The distance was short, barely 2 miles across the narrowest stretch of water. Shells began to fall with growing frequency. Day after day, the island absorbed the punishment. Concrete cracked. Power lines snapped. Water systems were damaged. Above ground, defensive positions were reduced to rubble. But beneath the rock, inside the Malinta tunnel system, thousands of defenders remained shielded, waiting. And with Bataan gone, Corregidor was no longer a supporting fortress. It was the final American stronghold in the Philippines. The fortress beneath the rock by mid-April 1942, the island fortress of Corregidor Island had become a target measured in grids and firing tables. Japanese artillery crews across the narrow channel on Bataan adjusted their guns daily. Observers tracked impact points. Fire grew more precise. What had begun as harassment evolved into systematic destruction. On April 28th, a concentrated bombardment began. For days, hundreds of shells rained down. Heavy 240mm howitzers pounded topside, where the largest coastal batteries stood. Aircraft joined the assault, dropping bombs that sent pillars of dust hundreds of feet into the air. The island shook continuously. Men later described it as living inside an earthquake that would not end. Above ground, defensive positions were collapsing. The great seacoast guns, designed to fire outward at naval targets, were nearly useless against artillery hidden inland on Bataan. Many could not depress low enough to strike back effectively. Others had limited high-explosive ammunition, built primarily for armor-piercing roles against ships. Corregidor's defenses had been engineered for a different war. Beneath the island, the Malinta Tunnel became the center of gravity. Originally constructed between 1922 and 1932 by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the main tunnel ran approximately 830 feet east to west, with numerous lateral corridors branching off into storage rooms, hospital wards, and command posts. Reinforced concrete arches protected it from direct hits. Massive steel doors could seal sections if necessary. Inside, nearly 4,000 people crowded into the dim corridors. Soldiers, nurses, doctors, signal operators, Filipino officials, and civilian refugees. Air was thick with humidity and the smell of sweat, antiseptic, and diesel exhaust from generators. Electric light bulbs cast a yellow glow over maps and cots lined side by side. The underground hospital operated continuously. Surgeons worked with limited anesthesia. Plasma supplies ran low. Water had to be strictly controlled. Bombardment had damaged portions of the island's storage facilities. Every gallon mattered. Lieutenant General Jonathan M. Wainwright now carried full responsibility for the defense. He knew the situation was deteriorating. Without air support, without naval reinforcement, without meaningful resupply, Corregidor's fate was narrowing toward inevitability. Yet surrender was not immediate. American and Filipino troops still manned beach defenses. Infantry units dug shallow foxholes among shattered trees. Artillery crews continued firing when targets presented themselves. Anti-aircraft guns barked defiantly at incoming bombers, even as ammunition stocks dwindled. Across the water, Japanese command assessed the fortress carefully. General Masaharu Homa's 14th Army had already achieved its primary objective with the fall of Bataan, but Corregidor remained a symbolic obstacle. Its presence denied Japan uncontested control of Manila Bay, its radio transmissions signaled continued resistance, and its mere survival stood as defiance. Plans were drafted for a direct amphibious assault. Japanese engineers studied tide patterns and currents around the island's northeastern shore. Assault units were selected, including elements of the 61st Infantry Regiment and supporting artillery. Barges and landing craft were assembled under camouflage along Batane's coastline. The bombardment intensified to soften resistance before the landing. By early May, daily shell counts reached into the thousands. Entire sections of topside were reduced to craters. The once ordered layout of barracks and batteries had become a jagged landscape of twisted steel and broken concrete. Communication lines were repeatedly severed. Runners replaced telephones. Smoke obscured observation points. On May 3rd and May 4th, the heaviest bombardment yet struck the island. Japanese aircraft dropped high explosive and incendiary bombs in coordinated waves. Fires spread across bottomside, threatening supply dumps. Ammunition depots exploded. Debris rained down near tunnel entrances. Inside Malinta, dust fell from the ceilings with every impact. Electric lights flickered. Some sections briefly lost power, yet the tunnel held. The Japanese believed the defenders were nearing collapse. Intelligence reports suggested food would soon be exhausted. Medical capacity was overwhelmed. Many forward positions had fallen silent under the barrage. To observers across the water, Corregidor appeared broken. On the night of May 5, 1942, under cover of darkness and artillery smoke, Japanese landing craft began crossing the narrow channel toward the island's eastern beaches. Their objective was clear: surround the remaining American defenders, crush resistance, and end the siege in a single decisive stroke. From offshore, the fortress looked devastated. What the attackers could not see was that thousands of exhausted but organized troops still waited, underground, shielded from the worst of the bombardment, positioned to counterattack from concealed exits, and prepared to fight at close quarters among the ruins. The surface of Corregidor appeared silent, but beneath it, movement had already begun. Inside the Malinta tunnel on Corregidor Island, time lost its shape. There was no sunrise underground, no horizon. Only the steady vibration of bombardment and the dim glow of electric bulbs strung along damp concrete walls. By early May 1942, the men stationed there had endured nearly 5 months of siege warfare. Many had already fought on Batane before withdrawing across the bay. They carried malaria in their blood, weight loss in their frames, and exhaustion behind their eyes. Rations had been cut repeatedly, sometimes down to half portions. Rice was stretched thin. Canned goods dwindled. Coffee disappeared. Sleep came in fragments. Every explosion above ground sent dust drifting from the tunnel ceiling. Conversations paused instinctively at each impact, as if listening for a deeper crack, a sound that might signal structural failure. Yet the tunnel held, and so did the men. In the hospital laterals, Army and Navy nurses worked in suffocating heat. Surgical teams operated through long shifts without relief. Morphine supplies were limited. Plasma was rationed carefully. Casualties from bombardment arrived daily: concussions, shrapnel wounds, burns. There were moments of silence, but never peace. Despite everything, discipline remained intact. Guards rotated through shifts at tunnel entrances. Officers maintained unit cohesion. Chaplains moved quietly among the cots, offering brief prayers. Letters were written but could not be sent. Radios transmitted coded reports to distant stations. Though responses grew infrequent, for many, the tunnel became both sanctuary and prison. Above them, the island was being dismantled. But below, an entire defensive force waited, breathing the same recycled air, listening to the same artillery rhythm, knowing that when the enemy finally came ashore, there would be nowhere left to retreat. Corregidor had been engineered in the early 20th century as a coastal fortress guarding Manila Bay, its massive disappearing guns and reinforced batteries were designed to repel enemy fleets attempting naval entry. But by 1942, the nature of warfare had shifted. Japanese dominance in the air neutralized many of the island's advantages. Aircraft could strike from above with precision. Artillery positioned inland on Batane could arc shells over protective seaward emplacements. The fortress, once considered nearly impregnable, found itself vulnerable from directions it had not been designed to resist. Most of Corregidor's largest guns faced outward toward the sea. Their armor-piercing shells were intended to penetrate battleship hulls, not to scatter infantry or silence inland artillery. high explosive ammunition was limited. Ammunition reserves overall were finite and resupply was impossible. Beach defenses were stronger but stretched thin. Infantry units were distributed along likely landing zones, especially the northeastern shore where terrain offered the most practical approach for an amphibious assault. Barbed wire entanglements and minefields were emplaced where possible, though weeks of bombardment had damaged many obstacles. Observation posts were repeatedly destroyed. Spotters had to relocate under fire. Communications lines snapped with alarming regularity. The defenders adapted, using runners, signal flags, and improvised relay systems. The Japanese command studied these weaknesses carefully. General Masaharu Hama understood that a prolonged siege would consume time and resources. A swift amphibious assault, if supported by overwhelming artillery preparation, offered the chance to shatter morale and seize the island in a concentrated blow. The chosen landing site near North Point offered narrow beaches but relatively direct access to the island's interior slopes. Japanese planners calculated that intense pre-landing bombardment would suppress most American positions long enough for infantry to secure a foothold. What they could not fully measure was the defensive advantage provided by the underground network. The Malinta Tunnel did more than shelter command staff. It preserved combat strength. While surface positions were reduced to rubble, significant numbers of troops remained physically intact beneath the island, protected from fragmentation and blast effects. From the outside, Corregidor appeared progressively silent, but silence did not mean absence. It meant preparation. The Malinta Tunnel system represented one of the most ambitious pre-war fortification projects undertaken by the United States in the Pacific. Carved into solid rock and reinforced with thick concrete arches, its main passage extended approximately 830 feet, with lateral tunnels branching like ribs from a spine. Ventilation shafts circulated air. Power generators supplied electricity independent of surface lines. Steel blast doors segmented key sections. During peacetime, it had been a logistical hub. In wartime, it became a subterranean fortress. Bombardment that would have annihilated open infantry units barely penetrated the tunnel's protective shell. Even near-miss explosions above ground translated into tremors rather than catastrophic collapse. This engineering resilience allowed command operations to continue long after surface installations had been destroyed. The Japanese had similar experience with fortified positions in China, but the scale of Corregidor's underground complex complicated their assault calculations. Artillery could crater hillsides and shatter concrete structures, but eliminating defenders sheltered in reinforced tunnels required direct infantry engagement. Flamethrowers, grenades, and close-quarters combat would ultimately decide control of tunnel exits. Thus, the battle for Corregidor was not merely a clash of numbers. It was a confrontation between early 20th century fortress design and modern combined arms assault doctrine. Above ground, the island appeared dying. Below ground, it was coiled, and as Japanese landing craft began assembling along the shores of Bataan, both sides understood that the next phase would unfold at intimate distance, rifle range, grenade arc, bayonet length. The bombardment was reaching its peak, the landing was imminent. When General Douglas MacArthur departed the Philippines in March 1942 under orders from President Franklin D. Roosevelt, command of the remaining forces fell to Lieutenant General Jonathan M. Wainwright. Wainwright was not a political general. He was a career cavalry officer, direct, unadorned, and visibly worn by the strain of command. When Bataan fell on April 9th, he inherited not only the defense of Corregidor Island, but the weight of every remaining Allied soldier in the archipelago. He understood the arithmetic. Supplies were critically low. Ammunition stocks could sustain only a short, concentrated defense. Medical facilities were overwhelmed. There was no realistic prospect of reinforcement. Naval relief was impossible under Japanese air dominance. Air support no longer existed. Yet surrender carried its own consequences. Corregidor was more than terrain. It was a symbol, the last American flag flying over the Philippines. Its survival sustained morale not only among defenders but across the Pacific. Radio broadcasts from the island still signaled resistance to the outside world. Wainwright faced a dilemma that had no clean solution. He could prolong the defense and risk total annihilation, Or he could preserve lives by capitulating when resistance became militarily futile. But determining that moment required judgment under chaos. As bombardment intensified in early May, he moved frequently within Malinta Tunnel, consulting staff officers, reviewing casualty lists, and studying shoreline reports. He visited hospital wards. He saw the cost firsthand. The decision would not be abstract, it would be personal. Across the narrow channel on Luzon, General Masaharu Homa's 14th Army prepared for its final task in the Philippines. Homa's earlier campaign had not been without difficulty. Bataan had resisted longer than expected, exhausting troops and supplies. Tokyo had expressed dissatisfaction with the pace of operations. The fall of Corregidor needed to be decisive. Japanese doctrine emphasized shock and concentration. Artillery would suppress. Aircraft would isolate. Infantry would exploit. The 61st Infantry Regiment, supported by engineers and artillery detachments, was selected for the initial assault. Units rehearsed night landings along similar coastlines. Equipment was checked repeatedly. Ammunition loads were increased to compensate for anticipated resistance. Japanese planners believed weeks of bombardment had shattered American cohesion. A rapid landing followed by aggressive inland advance would prevent defenders from regrouping. Intelligence suggested that surviving U.S. forces were concentrated near Malinta Hill and its tunnel complex. Securing that area would collapse organized resistance. The assault was scheduled for the night of May 5, 1942. Landing craft would cross under cover of darkness and artillery smoke. Initial waves would secure beachheads and clear immediate defenses. Follow-on units would push toward key elevations. Japanese forces expected fierce but brief opposition. They did not anticipate the scale of counterattack that would emerge from beneath the island. By the time Japanese landing craft began moving toward Corregidor's northeastern beaches, a narrative had already formed in the attackers' minds. The island was finished, surface defenses had been pulverized, gun positions were silent. Smoke obscured what remained of barracks and batteries. From across the water, Corregidor appeared hollowed out. Forward American positions had indeed suffered devastating losses. Many outposts were destroyed, communications were fractured. On the beaches, small defensive units faced overwhelming numbers. When the first waves of Japanese infantry landed shortly before midnight on May 5th, they encountered resistance, but it appeared fragmented. Machine gun nests were isolated. Counterfire came from scattered positions. To assault units advancing inland, it seemed they were encircling the final remnants. Reports filtered back through Japanese lines, enemy resistance weakening. Beach secured. Defenders falling back. What could not be seen was the controlled withdrawal of surviving American units toward interior slopes and tunnel exits. Officers coordinated movement through runners and prearranged signals. Reserve elements, sheltered underground during bombardment, were being prepared. The illusion of total collapse spread quickly among Japanese ranks. It was reinforced by darkness and smoke. But beneath Malinta Hill, men were forming up, rifles were checked. Ammunition distributed. Orders passed in low voices. When the counterattack came, it would not be from shattered surface trenches. It would rise from underground. And the night of May 5th would become something neither side fully anticipated. May 5th to 6th, 1942. The night landing shortly before 11:30 p.m. on May 5th, 1942. Japanese artillery along the Bataan shoreline intensified to a final, concentrated barrage. Shells struck the northeastern beaches of Corregidor Island in rapid succession. The ground convulsed. Sand and shattered coral sprayed into the air. Telephone lines that had been repaired hours earlier were severed again. American defenders braced inside shallow foxholes, their ears ringing, their vision blurred by dust. Then, through smoke drifting low across the water, shapes emerged. Japanese landing craft, low, narrow barges, pushed toward the beaches near North Point and Cavalry Point. Engines were cut in the final approach, oars dipped quietly. Assault troops prepared to disembark under cover of darkness. The first wave struck just before midnight. Machine guns opened from surviving American positions. Tracer rounds arced across black water. Some landing craft were hit before reaching shore. Others grounded on reefs and sandbars, forcing soldiers to wade forward under fire. But numbers told, Japanese infantry secured portions of the beachhead within the first hour. Engineers began clearing wire obstacles and marking lanes. More craft followed. The defenders on the shoreline, elements of the 4th Marine Regiment, U.S. Army Coastal Artillery units fighting as infantry, and Filipino scouts, resisted fiercely. Grenades exploded at close range. Bayonets were fixed. Fighting became fragmented and chaotic among shattered trees and craters. By 1:30 a.m., Japanese units had begun pushing inland. American reports reaching Malinta Tunnel were incomplete. Some forward observers had been killed. Others transmitted brief clipped messages before lines went dead. Enemy landed in force. Heavy pressure. Request reinforcements. Inside the tunnel, Lieutenant General Jonathan M. Wainwright assessed the situation with his staff. Reserve units were limited. Ammunition stocks were already dangerously low. Yet allowing the Japanese to consolidate on the island's interior slopes would split the defense in half. Orders were issued. Units that had been sheltered during bombardment were to move toward threatened sectors. Men who had endured weeks underground now climbed toward the surface through lateral exits and service openings. On the beaches, the Japanese believed momentum was theirs. By 2 a.m., assault troops reported American resistance thinning in certain sectors. Portions of the defensive line appeared to be falling back toward higher ground. In darkness and confusion, it seemed the defenders were collapsing into disarray. But what appeared to be retreat was, in several areas, controlled repositioning. American officers attempted to establish a defensive line along the high ground. Between the beaches and Malinta Hill, the terrain, cratered and uneven, made coordinated movement difficult. Smoke limited visibility to mere yards. Japanese reinforcements continued to land. By 3 a.m., more than 1,000 assault troops were ashore. Fighting intensified near Battery Denver and along the slopes leading toward the island's center. Mortar thumped at close range. Hand-to-hand combat erupted in pockets where units collided unexpectedly in darkness. One Japanese report later described the battlefield as a confusion of shouts and shadows. The defenders were under severe strain. Casualty reports mounted rapidly. Ammunition expenditure exceeded projections. Some American units found themselves nearly surrounded. At least one sector near the eastern shoreline was temporarily overrun before being contested again. Yet beneath Malinta Hill, more troops were forming, sheltered during the bombardment. They had been preserved as a reserve force. Now they were moving upward, through narrow exits, past shattered debris, into the open night. Shortly after 4 a.m., Japanese units advancing inland encountered fresh resistance, not scattered survivors, organized formations. American counterattacks struck near the center of the island's defensive perimeter. Rifle fire intensified. Machine guns reopened from positions thought destroyed. Artillery pieces that had been silent resumed firing at short range. The assumption that Corregidor had been reduced to its final exhausted defenders began to unravel. But Japanese forces were still increasing in number. As dawn approached on May 6th, the battle was no longer confined to the beaches. It was spreading toward the heart of the island, toward the tunnels that had shielded the defenders for months. And the most critical hours were still ahead. The emergence from underground as the night of May 5th bled into the early hours of May 6, 1942. The battle for Corregidor Island entered its most intimate phase. Smoke thinned slightly with the first hint of dawn. Shapes became clearer. So did the cost along the island's interior slopes. Japanese units advancing toward Malinta Hill encountered resistance that no longer matched their expectations. Machine guns fired from positions that had appeared destroyed hours earlier. Rifle volleys came from elevated ground, coordinated and disciplined. The source of this resistance was not improvisation. It was emergence. From tunnel exits concealed along the island's spine, American troops moved into the fight. Many had been preserved underground during the heaviest bombardment. Their uniforms were dusty but intact. Their weapons had been shielded from shrapnel and blast. They had strength left. Counterattacks struck Japanese units attempting to consolidate inland. In several sectors, American forces briefly regained ground. Fighting devolved into close-quarters engagements. Grenades thrown at short range, bayonets fixed, men grappling in smoke and shadow. For Japanese assault troops, the psychological shock was immediate. They had believed they were facing the final remnants of a beaten garrison. Instead, organized resistance was expanding. Positions thought secured came under renewed fire. Commanders struggled to maintain cohesion as units became intermingled in broken terrain. Yet the imbalance remained decisive. Japanese forces continued landing throughout the night. Artillery support from Bataan resumed as daylight improved visibility. Aircraft returned overhead, strafing known defensive positions and tunnel entrances when identified. American ammunition stocks dropped rapidly. Machine gun belts were nearly exhausted in some units. Rifle ammunition had to be redistributed by hand under fire. Medical evacuation became impossible in forward areas. Wounded men lay where they fell, tended by comrades when possible. Lieutenant General Jonathan M. Wainwright received fragmentary reports inside Malinta Tunnel. Some spoke of temporary successes. Others described units isolated or overwhelmed. The situation map became increasingly chaotic. One fact was undeniable. Japanese forces were now firmly established on Corregidor. By mid-morning on May 6th, enemy units had pushed within artillery range of Malinta Hill itself. Shells began striking near tunnel entrances. One bomb detonated near the hospital lateral, killing and wounding patients and staff. The sanctuary was no longer secure. Wainwright faced the reality he had hoped to delay. Further resistance would likely result in the destruction of the tunnel complex, and with it, thousands of wounded who could not be moved. The defenders had demonstrated extraordinary resolve, but the tactical situation had crossed a threshold. Shortly before noon, Wainwright transmitted a message to Japanese command proposing surrender. He insisted that surrender apply only to Corregidor and its immediate garrison. He feared for the fate of other isolated American units throughout the Philippines if resistance continued in name only. The Japanese response was uncompromising. They demanded unconditional surrender of all Allied forces in the Philippines. Wainwright hesitated, but artillery fire was now striking closer. Hospital casualties mounted. Communications were failing. The prospect of organized resistance had evaporated. At approximately 12 p.m. on May 6, 1942, Wainwright ordered the white flag raised over Corregidor. The guns fell silent. For the first time since December, American resistance in the Philippines ceased. Japanese troops entered Malinta Tunnel cautiously, weapons ready. They encountered exhausted, wounded defenders, men who had fought from beaches, from rubble, and from beneath the earth. The battle had ended not because the defenders lacked courage, but because they had exhausted every remaining option. The emergence from underground had delayed defeat. It had not prevented it, yet what followed would extend the cost of Corregidor far beyond the island itself. Captivity and consequence. When the white flag was raised over Corregidor Island on May 6, 1942, the battle ended, but the ordeal did not. Approximately 11,000 American and Filipino troops on the island entered captivity that day, joining the tens of thousands who had already surrendered on Bataan weeks earlier. Among them was Lieutenant General Jonathan M. Wainwright, now the highest-ranking American officer to be captured by enemy forces during the war. Japanese troops moved methodically through Malinta Tunnel, disarming defenders and organizing prisoners into groups. Many of the wounded remained where they lay. Medical supplies were nearly gone. Food stocks had been exhausted to the point of near starvation. For the Japanese command, the fall of Corregidor completed the conquest of the Philippines. Manila Bay was secure. Organized Allied resistance had collapsed. Tokyo announced the victory as proof of imperial expansion and military superiority. But for the prisoners, a new struggle began immediately. Conditions deteriorated rapidly. The garrison of Corregidor had endured months of reduced rations before surrender. Malnutrition was widespread. Malaria, dysentery, and tropical infections had weakened immune systems. When prisoners were assembled for transport, many could barely stand. They were ferried across the same narrow waters they had defended for months, now, as captives, toward Luzon. From there, many were marched or transported under harsh conditions to prison camps such as Cabanatuan. The brutality that had characterized the Bataan Death March did not end with Bataan. While the Corregidor prisoners did not endure the same extended forced march, They entered a system already strained and indifferent to human survival. Overcrowded camps, insufficient food, limited medical care, and forced labor became routine. Officers were separated from enlisted men. Filipino troops often faced even harsher treatment. Disease spread easily in tropical heat and unsanitary quarters. Wainwright himself would be transported across Asia, eventually to camps in Formosa and later Manchuria, spending the remainder of the war in captivity. He would not see liberation until August 1945. For the United States, the fall of Corregidor represented one of the darkest chapters of the early Pacific War. Since the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, American forces had suffered a cascade of defeats across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Guam had fallen. Wake Island had been overrun. Singapore had surrendered to Japanese forces in February 1942. Now, with the Philippines lost, Japan's defensive perimeter extended across vast territory. Strategically, the capture of Corregidor freed Japanese divisions for redeployment elsewhere in the Pacific. It secured sea lanes to resource-rich regions of Southeast Asia. It removed a persistent Allied stronghold from the map. Psychologically, the blow was severe. Newspapers in the United States reported the surrender with heavy headlines. Images of emaciated prisoners and accounts of desperate defense filtered slowly back home. The names Bataan and Corregidor became synonymous with sacrifice and with unfinished business. President Franklin D. Roosevelt acknowledged the loss but emphasized endurance. The war in the Pacific, he reminded the public, was only beginning. And far from the ruins of Corregidor in Australia, General Douglas MacArthur repeated the promise he had made upon departure. "I shall return." For the men who had emerged from underground to fight that final night, captivity now replaced combat. Yet their resistance, brief though its final surge had been, had altered something intangible. Corregidor had not fallen quietly. It had fought from the surface and from beneath it, and the memory of that resistance would shape how the United States prepared for the long campaign still ahead. The last stand beneath the rock Corregidor Island rests quietly now, a jagged silhouette against Manila Bay, yet in May 1942, it was alive with fire, smoke, and the echoes of desperate defiance. Beneath the shattered ridges in the Malinta Tunnel, men had endured the impossible: starvation, bombardment, disease, and encirclement. And still, when the moment came, they rose. The emergence from underground was more than a tactical maneuver. It was a statement. Even when surrounded, even when the world seemed to have abandoned them, courage could find a way to assert itself. Rifles cracked through the night. Machine guns barked from positions thought destroyed. Shadows became soldiers. Shadows became resistance. The psychological weight of that night would ripple far beyond the island's rocky shores. Strategically, Corregidor demonstrated the value of preparation, engineering, and adaptability. A fortress designed for another era had delayed the enemy through ingenuity and human resilience. Its tunnels protected the weak, preserved command, and enabled counteraction even in the darkest hours. These lessons would echo through every island campaign that followed: Guadalcanal, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, wherever men fought from caves, tunnels, or underground bunkers. But above all, Corregidor speaks to the human dimension of war. It reminds us that victory and defeat are measured not only in maps or statistics, but in the quiet endurance of those who persist when hope is scarce. The men who rose from the tunnels did not change the outcome, but they shaped the story, leaving a legacy of courage, defiance, and the unyielding will to resist. Today, standing on Corregidor's craggy hills, one can see the outlines of batteries, the scars of shellfire, and the faint entrances to the Malinta Tunnel. The island is silent. Yet if one listens closely, history whispers, even in the depths, even beneath rubble, humanity finds a way to rise. And in that rise, Corregidor became immortal, not just as a fortress, but as a testament to the resilience of those who refused to surrender.